What they are keeping from us is any statistical evidence, really, that would show us quite clearly, with empirical data, the effects of this. So we're talking about crime rates and who's committing those crimes. And particularly what interested me or concerns me the most is when it comes to sex crimes against women. Because my own experience as a woman who's been living in London on and off for most of my adult life is it has changed. My personal safety has changed. My experience here has changed. Foreign-born men were 3 times more likely to have committed rape than domestic-born men.
When the rape gang story went global because Elon Musk broadcast tweets by the likes of Sam Bidwell and Max Tempers, the government was busy cooking up a report saying that if you talk about this, it's a far-right grievance narrative that's been invented whole cloth to demonise Muslims. We're also seeing an Islamophobia blasphemy council at the moment.
Welcome back to Deprogrammed. This is the NCF show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, especially among the young. I'm Harrison Pitt, a fellow at the New Culture Forum, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever now, by Connor Tomlinson, one of the leading contributors at Courage Media, and our special guest this week, Alex Phillips, Talk TV presenter and the lady behind the New Culture Forum's latest documentary, Britain's Silent Rape Explosion. Let's have a quick look at that.
In 2013, there were over 16,000 incidents of reported rapes in the United Kingdom. By 2022, this increased to over 69,000, less than a decade on, more than a 400% increase. Shocking. We're told it's because women now report rapes more often, a conniving sleight of hand that doesn't bear scrutiny. More reports mean more incidents. If anything, women are increasingly disinclined to engage the authorities. Such is the lack of trust and the normalization of abusive practices. This harrowing trend echoes throughout Western Europe, from Finland to Denmark, Sweden, Germany and France. But why? Something else has shot up in these nations: mass migration. Let's look to Germany. Shocking figures show that between 2017 and 2021, Afghans and Pakistanis were 16 times more likely to be implicated in rape than German citizens.
So do be sure to watch that if you haven't already. It's an excellent documentary and it's been making waves. Alex, what is the British state hiding from us?
I think the British state is very convincingly hiding quite the level of cultural vandalism that's taken place over the last number of decades. When you look at the migratory flows that we know about, it's bound to have not just a huge economic effect and a strain on public services, but a huge strain on cultural cohesion. And I think the figures that we have in regard of how many people have come into the country themselves are massaged. When you look at it's estimated 1 in 12 people in London is here illegally. I'd imagine it's more. That's, what we potentially know about. But then it's the offspins of this and the ramifications of such huge demographic and cultural change in such a concentrated period of time. What they are keeping from us is any statistical evidence, really, that would show us quite clearly, with empirical data, the effects of this. So we're talking about crime rates and who's committing those crimes. And particularly what interested me or concerns me the most is when it comes to sex crimes against women. Because my own experience as a woman who's been living in London on and off for most of my adult life is it has changed. My personal safety has changed. My experience here has changed.
And is this something that your female friends feel as well?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting, though. You will always have a cohort of women who don't want to believe it's true because they're naturally leftist ideologically, and so will actually sort of almost gaslight themselves into pretending that these things aren't happening. Then you'll have a number of women who are probably completely impervious to this. If you're a woman past a certain age, or if you're a woman of a certain look, then you're less likely to be harassed of, let's say, a much younger woman with certain physical attributes. And then you've got, I always say to men, well, you probably don't see it because if you're walking with a woman down the street, another man's not going to come up and harass her. So there's all sorts of people who might not have as much experience as others. But when you've got young women who are predominantly single, who are going around London by themselves, then, yeah, they're pretty much all of them have had this sort of experiences I've had.
Before Connor comes in, one of the problems, as I understand it, that we face in Britain is that the sexual crime data isn't disaggregated by ethnicity, race and religion quite as diligently as it is in some parts of the continent. By no means all parts of the continent. France is pretty hushed about it as well, because they have this sort of universalist tradition there where you can't take an interest in that sort of thing. But in Denmark and in Germany, I believe they're quite diligent about this. How I mean, I don't doubt it in the least, but how then did you feel that you had the confidence to say that Britain is undergoing a silent rape explosion that can be blamed on mass immigration if the data is not there?
Okay,
how did you get around that charge?
We have some data. We actually do have some data, and the data that we do have is from last year and on actually people in prisons and by nationality and the crime that they committed. And from using that data alone, which is albeit a small snapshot, you could see that foreign-born men were 3 times more likely to have committed rape than domestic-born men. But then, we know from looking at the grooming gangs crisis what's going on here. Once upon a time when police used to publish mugshots on their timelines on social media, you could see who the usual suspects were. This isn't to say that, rape and sexual abuse and sexual assault is an entirely foreign-born phenomenon. Of course, plenty of people perpetrate, far too many people perpetrate that, who are British-born. But I think it's very clear to see culturally what would happen if you take a man out of a society where women are expected to fully adorn in, burqas, hijabs, niqabs, whatever, not supposed to go out without a male escort, and in even stricter societies, not allowed to talk very loudly or listen to music. It goes on. But even if you've got a less conservative Muslim background, the relationship between men and women, the freedom of women, and particularly the sexual liberty of women is nowhere near the same as you have in the West. What you've now got in the West, actually, is a hypersexualization. You've got this sort of pushing, this promulgation of permissiveness, the likes of which just weren't around in my childhood. You didn't, thank goodness, things like Instagram didn't exist, but you certainly didn't have 13, 14-year-old girls wanting to, puff up their lips and stick out their backsides and pretend to be a Kardashian. You put all of this stuff together, and it's very obvious what is going to happen. And it is happening. There is plenty of newspaper stories out there. There's plenty of reports of young girls and men hanging around school gates. And there's plenty of women who feel like they've just not been listened to for so long because they're not allowed to say, when I walk down the street, I'm being hissed at by men, I'm being followed by men, I'm being leered at by men. And this is predominantly the type of men.
I suppose the relentlessness of the news cycle as well numbs people to this. I think it was only yesterday that it emerged that there was a girl in Stirlingshire, 15-year-old girl in Stirlingshire, who was 15-year-old who was raped because she was unaccompanied by an Afghan asylum seeker, Connor.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because you said about the gaslighting efforts that we're currently being faced when we suggest that if you mass import lots of, third world men from violent Muslim backgrounds, and then you end up with predominantly Pakistani Muslim rape gangs, and why you must ask what all these Mohammeds must have in common. You're told that you're a far-right racist, particularly by the government, as we've documented time and time again. When the rape gang story went global because Elon Musk broadcast tweets by the likes of Sam Bidwell and Max Tempers, the government was busy cooking up a report saying that if you talk about this, it's a far-right grievance narrative that's been invented whole cloth to demonize Muslims. We're also seeing an Islamophobia blasphemy council at the moment. The definition was cooked up by Hope Not Hate, and itself said any conversation about a grooming gang is pulling out old racist tropes to characterize Muslims as sex groomers. So I wanted to ask, obviously, since the documentary's been out, what sort of reception have you had? Have you faced much hostility from it?
No, none. None. And, I've been banging the drum for these sorts of issues for quite a long time now. And it first sort of really started doing the rounds in the UK when I'd mentioned it when I was back presenting on Talk TV. And I talked about street harassment. And in this little clip somewhere, I don't know who, someone clipped it, put it up on TikTok or whatever. And then it got drawn off TikTok and put on X. And it just did the rounds. It seemed to globally fly off the shelves because so many people, I think, identified with what I was saying. And it's interesting when you talk about when Elon Musk went, what is going on in Britain? It's the first time he had heard of the rape gangs. And yet we've known about this now. It's been in the public domain for a decade. That moment really held a mirror up to our society where you suddenly go, wow, when it comes to uncomfortableness with talking about something, when it comes to the sense that you cannot talk about something, when it comes to being aware that there's a cover-up but not even wanting to give voice to that, look how far down that road we've now walked. That, another country's picked up on this and gone, bloody hell, Britain, what have you done? And it's one of those moments you think, oh my gosh, and I've kind of been complicit in this because I've also been too afraid to talk about things, too afraid to voice my concerns. And the difficulty we have in society is that the legacy media aren't going to bang a drum about this. Politicians and public officers are going to do their best to try and cover it up because I think they think we've got to the point now that trying to air it is actually going to be more incendiary, and Lord knows what fallout will come if we do start having bigger and louder conversations. And so individual members of the public kind of are by themselves, but they don't realise that, they're sitting in the same room as a load of other people who are thinking, I really want to talk about this as well.
Well, if I can acquit you a little bit of the allegation that you were too censorious about this, as you said, it's been in the public domain for about 10 years, especially since 2013 when the first trials started rolling around with Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford and the like. You were involved in UKIP for a while. They were...
Oh, yeah, head of media for UKIP. It was big in UKIP.
Exactly. They took a stance on this. I think they were the only prominent political party that bothered to talk about it at the time. I think Reform's manifesto kept that commitment last election cycle to say that they would give whole life orders and deportation to the perpetrators of this. Rupert Lowe has now come out and said that all the families that covered up for it should do exactly the same. And I wanted to use that as an example to say we do know that this is a cultural phenomenon for those areas of the world because the perpetrators and their families themselves have been very open about this. Like in trials of the Rotherham rapists, they shouted Allahu Akbar when they were sentenced in court. There was a member of the Rochdale grooming gang who went on a racist tirade saying Pakistanis are the supreme race and you're all going to burn in hell during his sentencing. Like this is, again, as you said, these have been in the public domain for 10 years and we've known about this and people have been far too icky to talk about it. So do you think that obviously the fact that you haven't received much backlash, are we getting into a place where it's more comfortable to talk about? And do you think that's going to translate into any action?
I'll tell you what's happened. I'll tell you what I did. I used the word lived experience, and that just closes down the debate. Because I was able to say, I am a blonde-haired woman who lives in central London, who moves around, by myself, and this is what has happened to me. And so anyone who then turns around and says, you're a racist, you're doing this, it makes it very hard. If you start playing the game by their rules, makes it very hard then. It'd be much harder, I think, for a man to have a conversation about this or other people. But if you can turn around and say, this has happened to me, this is what's going on in my life. And if people kind of look at you and think, well, what do I say then? Because I'm actually telling a woman, I'm either victim blaming or telling her that she can't talk out about sexual abuse or sexual harassment. So I think it's sort of given me it shouldn't have to give me a sort of cultural, politically correct force field. Anyone should be able to talk about these things. But the fact that I am a young woman and I've been able to talk about it from personal experience has made it very difficult for people to say to me, you're a racist, you're a Islamophobe, you're a xenophobe, etc.
It probably does help that you use the word lived experience then. In fact, if you relied on the data alone, they might have accused you of weaponising socially constructed white ways of knowing, and then you would have been completely cornered. And
white ways of knowing.
That's the academic jargon, yes. Yes, they would have said that. They would have said that the very sort of epistemic tools that you're using to come to these conclusions are themselves tainted by white supremacy. That's genuinely the argument.
Oh, do you remember the old Smithsonian chart where they said being on time and speaking Queen's English is white supremacy?
Punctuality is white, being on time.
My later days, so I was doing my bit for DEI then.
This is why some of the more radical critical race theorists say that 2 + 2 = 4 might actually be somewhat racist. But anyway, we'll get off that little academic avenue for the moment. Just to talk a little bit more about the data, one of the things you do point to in the documentary, Alex, is that ethnicity not recorded has become more prominent around the continent conspicuously since 2015, where there was obviously a big influx of immigration from the Muslim world. So there are good so it's not you're not just relying on the foreign-born prison population, which would probably churn out pretty conservative estimates, because just because someone was born in a foreign country doesn't mean that they're not a second-generation immigrant. That would probably make it even more.
And also we're talking about crimes that have been convicted, which when it comes to sex crimes is vanishingly small.
Exactly. So can you say a little bit more about that ethnicity not recorded stuff? And
well, what's interesting interesting is now the onus, it seems, on the police, as far as I can tell from the various forces, and all forces do their recording differently, which I find utterly astonishing. You'd think there should be, if you're going to be able to gather national data in a way that you're going to be able to predict trends and actually use that for the good of policy making, you should surely have a sort of homogenous recording protocol, but that is not what's gone on here. But a number of forces say, well, we only record the data of the victim. And you think, well, why is that? Because then you could say, when it comes to stabbing, black kids are all the victims. It's like, well, they're probably also the perpetrators by and large. But, I say this, right? Whenever people talk about racist Britain and, how terrible it is here and how obnoxious we all are and xenophobic we all are and how dangerous it is, how, people from minorities feel unsafe. I was trying to think the other day of the last time there were sort of big headlines of essentially a racially motivated attack. And the only one I could think of was Stephen Lawrence.
And even then, the Macpherson report itself accused the Met Police of institutional racism, but there was no proof that the Met would have handled the murder differently if he was a white victim.
The Stephen Lawrence thing sort of was a shocked society. His mother, Doreen, is now a peer and, set up a foundation and all this campaigning and so on and so forth. And I'm thinking, if there had been another such attack, it would have been everywhere in the newspapers, because these things are. And I can't think of one.
That's why we had to import George Floyd.
We had to import George Floyd, who, again, is just, when it comes to picking your martyr, you could have probably found someone who fit the description a bit better. But this is it. It's all confected. And yet the real things that are genuinely plaguing society, which do tend to fall across racial divides, we're not allowed to talk about. Those things are being accused of being confected. So we're in this sort of ridiculous situation where truth is fake news and fake news is the truth. And there's no way of arguing against it anymore. It's almost like this mythology has now been so compounded into sort of folklore that there is no way now to talk about it publicly other than the sort of stuff that you guys do, that more and more people are switching on to and thinking, thank goodness this content exists.
Well, it's important you raise Stephen Lawrence, actually, because I think that might be one of the reasons why police don't want to record ethnicity, because they do record sex. That's very notable. So they can eyeball the fact that, or maybe just ask their preferred gender on any given day.
I was going to say, they record sex according to the person who's committed the crime.
Yes, exactly, yeah. So there you go.
The proverbial female rapist.
Quite, yes. But in 98% of cases, they record a sex for the perpetrator, but they don't record an ethnicity or a race, etc. And I think part of this is because of the anti-racist policing guidelines have been put in place since Stephen Lawrence. I mean, we know that non-crime hate incidents are because of the Macpherson report. It was... about 14 odd years after the report was even published that they adopted this, and the police started recording thought crimes against the public to prove that the police themselves were not racist. So I wonder how much of that, because this links back to something.
Right.
You said earlier that, yes, there are lots of white British people that commit these rapes.
Well, there'll be plenty. There'll be, unfortunately, too large an amount, because one person's too large an amount of white people who rape people. Of course there are. Yes. I grew up in Gloucester, land of Fred West. You can have white people, a white man and a woman, acting together to torture, rape and murder white girls. Yep. So, in terms of, then they were groomers,
Must say, I hope that's not the slogan of the Gloucestershire Tourist Board. Land of Fred West.
Yeah,
land of Fred West. But, so therefore, the idea that these crimes are sort of solely or particularly bound to an ethnicity, I think is, not what we're discussing here. Is it bound to culture? Well, I think yes. When it comes to misogyny, when it comes to sexual abuse, when it comes to harassment, when it comes to the way that men think they should, could, ought, whatever, treat women, that has huge culture. All of that stuff is baked into culture. That is the meaning of culture. So we do need to talk about culture when it comes to crimes that are essentially cultural crimes of men against women.
So the point I think I'm trying to get at here is the police not recording the ethnicity of the perpetrator is a conscious choice.
Yeah.
And just because they're a British rapist does not mean the government should be making a conscious choice to import more rapists from nations per capita where the culture makes them more likely to do so. Like, you're going to have more rapists from a nation where the age of consent is 9. So is all of this not just government policy choice?
Yeah. I mean, and it's, it's interesting when you sort of look at this and you think, how has this been allowed to happen? Because you don't need, we spend too much time, I think, in the West, especially when it comes to sensitive topics, having to try and find every last bit of data to drill down what is actually common sense. If you're taking a man from a culture where women are not sexually accessible at all, where they have no liberty, where they are essentially chattel or belong to men, then you put them in a culture where women are essentially promiscuous. What do you think is going to happen? Do you need, inquiries and millions of pounds spent on academic research to tell you what the likely fallout of that particular cocktail is going to be?
You don't even need to litigate the question of the extent to which it's ethnic or the extent to which it's cultural or whatever, or the extent to which it's religious or whatever it might be. All you need to do is engage in a simple thought experiment. And you need to say to people like Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper, would you prefer to send your young daughters unaccompanied to Switzerland, South Korea or Denmark on the one hand, or Somalia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan on the other? They will obviously answer the former, and then ask them, what is it about Pakistan, Somalia, and Rwanda that makes them so different from those North European and East Asian countries? It's not the topography, it's not the weather,
purely economic
it's not the climate, it's not economic factors, it's clearly the people. So why are you playing dice with the lives of people here by bringing those people over here in large numbers?
The irony is largely if you took the young daughters of Yvette Cooper or whatever, not she's got children, and they went to Sudan, Rwanda, or they'd probably be safer than in London because strangely it is, I think, that particular cocktail of the permissiveness of Western culture mixed with the importation of the men because when you look at the cultures in those countries, and I've lived in Africa a lot, lived in Ghana, I've lived in Kenya, I've spent a lot of time in Cameroon, I've worked in Nigeria, I've lived in India, I've worked in Pakistan. So I've embedded myself within those cultures as a woman with blonde hair, and you don't really get the same amount of harassment because it's sort of in that culture, if you dare do that to a woman, that is shameful. So in that they don't necessarily behave like this in their home countries even.
These places do have larger rape rates, don't they?
Well, look, I don't know about that. And again, without sort of doing the whole digging around for the empirical evidence and do we need to, the answer is I don't know. They probably, if you look at Sudan, definitely it's used as an act of war. And also because I think a lot of the teaching in these cultures tends to be that if a woman has the audacity to go out and about and get her groceries and have her hair out, then she deserves to be.
I suppose the point is that if you're going to import people from these places en masse, and then you're going to simultaneously gamble that the behaviours that are observable in those countries are not going to be replicated en masse here. You're basically betting the safety of our women and girls on a gamble on human nature. Well, and that strikes me as one of the most reckless things.
And this is the thing. We know this because we're like, isn't it terrible what's happening in Afghanistan? The Taliban are back in control. All the women are and then who's coming over on the boats? The men. Yeah, I'm sorry, but if you have a war in your country, the men stay at home and fight and you send your women and children to safety. If you're preparing for war, the women and children stay at home to be protected and look after the homestead and you send the men on boats.
Yes.
That's just, that's just as history tells us this.
And now, and yes, to put a fine point on that, we now have probably around 10 times more fighting age male illegal immigrants in this country than we do enlisted members of our armed forces.
Yeah.
Which is terrifying.
And we don't know. And this is, again, the thing that is not brought up enough. And thank goodness for J.D. Vance actually turning around and saying to Europe, you are suicidal. Even when it comes to, are these people on boats, what percentage and how can we slice and dice how many people are just genuine people who want to come over here because they're escaping persecution and poverty, and all of those things will be the case, right? But there will also be people who are directly connected to terrorist organisations. There'll also be people who have the scars of war, PTSD, who have come from violent circumstances where, because they've had no psychological healing, they act out in violence afterwards. But the very bare fact of this is, when someone's got in a boat, they've paid someone money. And who are those people they're paying the money to? It's terrorist organisations and hostile regimes, not NGOs.
Well, also, the story that I helped break to GB News in August 2023 was that North African people trafficking gangs, mainly in Algeria and Morocco, were filming women without their consent on nights out in states of undress and drunkenness in Manchester, Bradford, etc., and using those videos to market their services to the men that they were smuggling into this country, saying, well, these women are, as you said before, dressed not like the standards of the women in our country. They're willing and waiting. Come on over. They're the spoils of war. And this year just gone now, late last year, we got a guy that was convicted for doing that. And I will say, didn't have the most English of complexions when they knocked his door down and put him in cuffs.
But this is the thing, women are being used as the bait. I'm going to say something that, blimey, I'm getting out of my own comfort zone now, and that's saying something, right?
We have that effect on people here.
Yeah, saying something. Back with the early waves of migration, probably even now, when there's a sort of vox pops done of people who've just landed on a boat in Lampedusa, and the question is, which country do you want to go to? Which ones have they sort of normally listed? It's been Scandinavia, Germany, UK. And people have said, well, that's because obviously that's where the system's more generous. Well, maybe that is the case. But I do wonder somewhere in the back of my head as to whether there's the fetishization of the sort of Germanic, Nordic, Anglo-Saxon woman as well.
Well, you've spoken about this in regards to the porn industry before, which is absolutely right.
Right.
Yeah, and we know this is kind of been pushed to be the case because in the undercover recordings with sort of Pornhub executives, they've said, oh yeah, we've been purposefully manufacturing desires and tailoring content to put progressive themes in porn. So one of those themes would be, anti-racist relationships, for example. If that's being presented to other men from other countries and they're thinking, there's an entire continent of women here willing and waiting that are more promiscuous than the women in my country, and if all I do is take the opportunity, I might be able to take my chance.
Yeah.
I suspect it is a pretty strong motivator. I think you're onto something.
There is, at the end of the day, it's essentially, let's speak plainly. There's no point beating around the bush here. Blonde hair, blue eyes has always been fetishized. From the ancient Greeks to Marilyn Monroe to, you name it, it's always been fetishized in female beauty. And of course, it doesn't exist in the countries where these men are coming from particularly. And when they, go on the internet and look at pornography, the vast amount of pornography is again that fetishized look. You just have to look at the big black female pop stars, even that, you look at Beyonce, you look at the Kardashians, they themselves try to lighten their skin and have long blonde hair. It's a predominant sort of marker, a visual marker for female sexuality.
In East Asian countries as well, there are like walk-in clinics for skin bleaching. I saw it all the time when I was in Japan.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, they have hair extensions, they have different coloured contact lenses in cosmetic stores, they have white skin bleaching clinics.
That's gracious.
When you're 18 in South Korea, it's very common to get plastic surgery for your birthday to augment your eyelids and make your skin lighter. So you're not wrong. There is a commodified beauty standard around the world. And in the countries where women's safety is put at risk if they're not adhering to these standards of very oppressive modesty, then that becomes the example of who's asking for it.
Despite very strong reasons to suspect that third world immigrants are radically overrepresented in sex crime across Europe, our political media and I suppose entertainment / cultural / commercial class not only denies this, which would be bad enough, but very frequently inverts reality to suggest that the contrary is the case. I was struck recently by an advertisement promoting awareness around sexual harassment put out by Kent County Council.
Right.
And from the look of practically any other advert or any other film, I thought that white actors were in chronically short supply. I didn't think that they existed. But all of a sudden, when you want to find a pervert or a rapist or some other ne'er-do-gooder, they abound.
Yeah, I know.
And there's just one Asian guy who steps in to say, mate, leave her alone. She said no.
Same with the Gillette ad.
Same with the Gillette ad. It happens all of the time. It happens on the London
Thames Valley Police did a similar one.
They did indeed.
So TfL did the same thing.
And there was even, a series out recently about a sort of girl being harassed on the train by a guy, and she was sort of a young mixed race girl, and he was a leering white man. And no, they do. They do invert a lot lot of the time.
But to an already disgraceful cover-up, they're adding an even more disgraceful brazen lie, which, I mean, cannot but be calculated to demonize white people. It's a clear-cut case of anti-white propaganda.
It's just purposely endangering women, because it's telling lots of women, like, disarm yourselves around men that might be more likely to take advantage of you when you're in a vulnerable position for the sake of ideology.
Yeah.
So
now this is a very important point to make, which is on one hand, girls are being told that it's empowerment. I hate that word, but it's empowerment to be sexually liberal and use your body as a commodity, that is somehow preferable. And then they're also being told that men who put on dresses and want to come into the bathroom are victims and lovely and extra special. And they're also being told that, you know, if it's a sort of ragtag group of, you know, boat people standing outside the school gates, so they're probably lovely and fascinating, and you know, and girls are far more likely to absorb this stuff because they don't want to be seen to be abrasive in society. You know, part of the female mystique is being soft and kind and nice, and they're sort of more herd instinct as well. And so they're the most likely cohort to believe all of this stuff, and they're the most likely cohort to be the victims of it as well.
So where are the feminists on all this?
I don't know, where are the feminists? As far as I can tell, the feminists have packed up their bags and started waving Trans Lives Matter signs.
Yeah, yes.
I don't know, where are feminists?
How would you try and get through to people like Caroline Lucas who profess the feminist, not that I particularly care for the feminist mantle, by the way, but who profess the feminist mantle for what it's worth and are really interested in arcane things like the overrepresentation of male prepositions in academic writing, but don't care about the mass rape of white working class girls in Britain. I would, maybe not her, but her fans maybe might be more reachable.
The sad thing is, until this happens to them, to their daughters, and in their communities, until it becomes their lived experience, I don't think they are going to change. And there are some who are so sort of embedded now in the ideology that even if it did happen, you see these people sort of, you know, mad sort of liberal white women who have been raped by an asylum seeker who goes, the poor thing, it's not his fault. He's been so repressed. His sexuality and masculinity have been eunuched because he was forced to live on a boat and then in a bunk bed, you know, and you think, what? Sorry. So there are those who are sort of too far gone. And sadly, most of the people who espouse these issues are the sort of people who use these issues like a Gucci handbag. You know, it is a sort of luxury ideology because they can afford to do it, because their girls are growing up in suburbs where the demography is probably still very sort of white British, where the school's well funded. So even if you have a big mixed demography, you've got people who largely have Western values. Because this is the other important thing, and I think this is important to stress, as someone who has lived extensively in Commonwealth countries, there's a huge difference between a physicist coming from Pakistan and a goat herder coming from Pakistan when it comes to the cultural values. And the likelihood is, if I go to the GP surgery tomorrow and the doctors are Pakistani, I'm not going to worry about him if he needed to give me a physical examination. I'm not going to worry. I'm just not going to worry. He's a doctor, fine. But if, you know, he said, I'm going to have my coffee break, older, you know, Mohammed here, my nephew, who doesn't speak English. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, yes.
It's the way you are educated and the exposure you've got to Western culture and your levels of wealth directly correlate, I think, to your progressiveness, for want of a better term. And so when we're looking at immigration into this country, you have to actually also make a distinction on there will be plenty of very decent people coming from war-torn countries, coming from Muslim countries who are still perfectly capable of contributing and integrating when it comes to our society. But that is not who is coming into the country.
I think as well, I will say that the more people you source from those countries, even in those professions, like let's take doctors and nurses, for example, they're only 3% of annual migration. But especially after Brexit, the number of people that we've sourced for those professions from India, Pakistan, Nigeria, we're seeing rampant qualifications fraud. We're seeing more medical malpractice. And I think if you did get, let's say, 1,000 Pakistani doctors, you would see an increase in sexual assaults from doctors than you would just from 1,000 white British doctors, because the more people you get from that predictably retrogressive or repressed, or whatever word you want to use, cultural milieu, you're going to get that predictable outcome. So even then, we should set very selective migration criteria. But I think, for example, I mean, we probably both know someone very decent from Pakistan who's contributed and had their family.
Ben Habib and his family. I mean, he's
exactly.
a prime example.
Great example. I think Ben Habib would say, I would rather close the borders to Pakistan indefinitely and not have been able to come here, rather than me to be able to come here and thousands of other Pakistani rapists to have been able to come here.
Well, but this is the thing, actually. I mean, Ben Habib's mother is English. He
Yes.
was born and bred here and went to public school and was, the captain of rugby and all the rest of it.
Very different example to the majority.
But this is what I'm saying. This is where your wealth and your education has a huge impact then on your cultural values. So actually, and that's actually true from all countries, okay? So it doesn't necessarily even have to be a Muslim country or a different race. You could look at that from Ireland. Mm-hmm. If you're going to get a load of Irish physicists and professors over, great. If you're going to get a load of potato farmers who like a good drink, and do you know what I mean?
Totally.
As a country, you want to be importing the brightest and the best anyway. That's the bloody point.
When we're talking about the most heinous crimes, I would grant that one's profession is I would certainly not a surefire guarantee of behaviour, but certainly a fairly reliable proxy for likely behaviour. And so to that extent, just all else being equal, I would admit, if I had a choice between the two of them, I would admit the Pakistani physicist or doctor, and stay clear of the goat herder, as you suggested. Yes, so I would grant that. But I still think, given the astronomical levels we've already had, it's probably, if we were starting out the experiment, then maybe these sorts of proxy criteria would be relevant.
Right.
But now that we're halfway through a very reckless and dangerous experiment, my own view is that we should probably have something more like a moratorium. But we should say that we're pressed for time. Would you like to come back on that, or do you agree?
Blimey, that's a big long question. But what I would say is you're absolutely right. The problem is, and this is how we've gone full circle. I love a good narrative arc. But we have gone full circle because we started off this conversation with Connor basically talking about, so what are they keeping from you and why are they keeping it from you? And so to pick up on what you said, we are now halfway through this experiment and they've realised it has gone catastrophically wrong.
Well, it turns out you have a lot of fans, Alex. We've been summoning questions for you, and we're going to be doing them on our extra members section. So please do stick around for that. Thank you for being with us up until now. Connor, thank you as ever. You've been watching Deprogram. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so. Consider signing up as a member if you want to catch Alex's answers, and we shall see you on the next one.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programmes, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.